It was a humid August night in 1967 when 17-year-old Michael Patterson first saw him. The kind of night where the air sits heavy on your chest and every shadow seems to breathe with a life of its own. Michael had been driving home late along Route 351 in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. The road stretched out before him like a black ribbon, cutting through dense woods on either side. His headlights barely penetrated the darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. That's when he saw the figure. At first, it was just a shape moving along the shoulder of the road. Michael assumed it was another late-night walker, maybe someone whose car had broken down. He slowed his vehicle, intending to offer help. But as his headlights illuminated the figure more clearly, his blood turned to ice. The man had no face. Where features should have been, eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was only smooth, stretched skin that gleamed an unnatural, almost greenish hue in the artificial light. The figure turned toward the car, and Michael saw that what he'd thought was smooth skin was actually horrifically scarred tissue, melted and reformed into something that barely resembled human anatomy. Michael screamed. His foot slammed on the accelerator, and his car lurched forward, tires squealing against the asphalt as he fled into the night. He didn't stop driving until he reached his family's farmhouse 5 miles away, where he stumbled inside, pale and shaking, unable to form coherent words for nearly an hour. His parents thought he'd lost his mind. His younger sister thought he was playing a cruel joke. But Michael knew what he'd seen, and he would never forget it. The man Michael encountered that night was named Thomas Mercer, though most people in Beaver County would come to know him by a different name, the Green Man. Some called him the Night Walker. Others whispered about the monster of Route 351. Thomas Mercer's story began on a scorching summer day in 1918. He was just 9 years old, playing with his best friend, James Sullivan, near the old Pennsylvania Railroad bridge that spanned Miller's Creek. The bridge was a forbidden place. Every parent in town warned their children to stay away from it. But like all children, Thomas and James were drawn to the forbidden. They'd been climbing on the bridge's metal framework when Thomas reached for a handhold and grabbed an exposed electrical wire. The voltage that surged through his small body was catastrophic. 9,000 volts of electricity entered through his right hand and exited through his feet, coursing through every nerve, every muscle, every cell. James watched in horror as his friend's body convulsed, smoke rising from his skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, a sickly sweet odor that James would never forget, that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. Thomas's screams echoed across the valley, a sound so terrible that workers at the mill a quarter-mile away stopped their machines, certain they'd heard a demon's wail. When Thomas finally fell from the wire, he collapsed onto the bridge's wooden planks, his body still twitching with residual electrical charges. James ran for help, tears streaming down his face, certain his friend was dead. But Thomas Mercer didn't die. He survived, though many would later say that death might have been a kinder fate. The electricity had destroyed most of his face. His nose was burned away completely. His eyes, though still present, were so badly damaged that he was left completely blind. His ears were reduced to small, malformed stumps. The skin across his face and scalp had melted, then reformed into tight, shiny scar tissue that pulled his features into a permanent, unnatural mask. His hands, too, were twisted and scarred, the fingers fused together in places. The young Thomas Mercer disappeared into his family's farmhouse after the accident, and for years, the townspeople rarely saw him. His parents, God-fearing people who loved their son despite his appearance, cared for him, taught him to navigate the world without sight, helped him adjust to his new reality. But Thomas knew what he'd become. He'd heard the gasps when the doctor first removed the bandages. He'd felt his mother's tears falling on his ruined hands as she held them. He'd sensed his younger siblings' fear when they first approached him after the accident. As Thomas grew into adulthood, he developed a routine. During the day, he stayed inside, away from prying eyes and cruel whispers. But at night, when the world was dark and his blindness didn't set him apart from the seeing, he would walk. He walked to feel alive, to feel the wind on his scarred skin, to hear the sounds of the world around him. To be, for a few hours, just a man taking a stroll, not a monster to be feared. His favorite route was a 9-mile stretch of Route 351, from the intersection near his home all the way to the old covered bridge at Buttermilk Falls. He knew every step of that road, every curve and dip. He used a walking stick, a gnarled piece of oak that clicked rhythmically against the pavement with each step, announcing his presence to the night. Thomas always wore the same outfit: dark trousers, a plaid shirt, and a worn denim jacket. He carried a small flashlight, not because he could see its beam, but because he'd learned that drivers were less likely to hit him if they could see him first. After Michael Patterson's encounter, the stories began to spread like wildfire through Beaver County. Jennifer Morrison, a nurse at the local hospital, was driving home from a late shift 2 weeks later when she saw him. She pulled over, thinking she might offer assistance, but when Thomas turned toward her car, she saw his face illuminated by her headlights. She fainted right there in the driver's seat, her car drifting into a ditch. When she came to, Thomas was gone, but she could hear his walking stick echoing in the darkness, growing fainter and fainter until there was only silence. The worst part? When she looked in her rearview mirror before she passed out, she swears she saw multiple shadowy figures standing in the trees behind Thomas, watching. She never drove that road again. The Kowalski twins, Robert and Richard, encountered him on a dare. Their friends had challenged them to drive Route 351 after midnight, promising that they'd see the legendary Green Man. The 15-year-old boys laughed off the warnings, certain it was just an urban legend. They weren't laughing when Thomas emerged from the tree line at exactly 12:47 a.m. Robert, who was driving, swerved so violently that the car nearly flipped. Richard screamed so loudly that he lost his voice for 3 days. They told everyone at school what they'd seen, their story growing more terrifying with each retelling. But what they didn't tell anyone, what they swore to keep secret, was what happened after they regained control of the car. When they looked back, Thomas was standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, and around him, the darkness seemed to pulse and breathe, as if the night itself was alive and drawn to him. The trees on either side of the road appeared to lean inward, reaching toward him with their twisted branches. The boys drove away as fast as they could, but for weeks afterward, they both had the same nightmare. Thomas standing at the foot of their beds, his ruined face inches from theirs, whispering words they could never quite remember when they woke up screaming. But those who actually spent time with Thomas Mercer knew a different story. Father O'Brien, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, was one of the few who befriended him. The priest would sometimes drive Route 351 late at night, pull over when he spotted Thomas, and offer him a ride. They would sit in the car and talk about baseball, about politics, about faith and suffering and the nature of God's plan. "He was the kindest man I ever knew," Father O'Brien would later say at Thomas's funeral. "His appearance was frightening, yes, but his soul was beautiful. He never complained, never asked, 'Why me?' He simply lived his life with grace and dignity." But not everyone was so understanding. The worst incident occurred on Halloween night in 1973. A group of 6 college students from Pittsburgh had heard the legends about the Green Man and decided to find him. They weren't looking for a thrill or playing a game. They wanted to capture proof of what they called the Pennsylvania Monster. They brought cameras, flashlights, and baseball bats. They found Thomas around 11 p.m., walking his usual route near the covered bridge. At first, they just followed him slowly in their car, shouting cruel taunts out the windows. "Hey monster, show us your face. What happened to you, freak? Did you crawl out of hell?" Thomas kept walking, his stick striking the ground with steady determination, ignoring them. He'd learned long ago that engaging with tormentors only encouraged them. But these young people weren't satisfied with just shouting. The driver, a football player named Derek Hansen, pulled the car in front of Thomas, blocking his path. The passengers piled out, surrounding him with a circle of flashlight beams that made him look like a specimen under examination. "Come on, Green Man," Derek said, his voice cold and cruel. "We know you're not human. What are you really? Some kind of demon?" Thomas tried to walk around them, but they pushed him back. One of them, a skinny student named Pete, grabbed Thomas's walking stick and snapped it in half over his knee, then threw the pieces into the woods. "What's wrong? Can't see where you're going?" Pete laughed and the others joined in. Without his stick, without his bearings, Thomas stumbled. He fell to his knees on the rough asphalt, his scarred hands scraping against the ground. The young people stood around him, taking photographs with their Polaroid cameras, talking about selling the pictures to tabloids. But then something happened that none of them could later explain. The temperature dropped suddenly. The air became so cold that their breath came out in white clouds, even though it was a mild autumn night. The street light above them began to flicker wildly, casting strange, dancing shadows. And then they heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from the woods on both sides of the road. Not an animal sound, not a human sound, something else entirely. The students backed away from Thomas, their earlier bravado evaporating. The rumbling grew louder, and now they could hear something moving through the underbrush. Multiple somethings, circling them, getting closer. One of the quieter members of the group, a young man named Christopher, suddenly helped Thomas to his feet. "We need to leave, now," he said, his voice shaking with genuine terror. Derek started to argue, but then he saw it. Pairs of eyes reflecting in the darkness between the trees. Dozens of them, watching, waiting. The group ran back to their car and fled, leaving Thomas alone on the road. But as they drove away, Christopher looked back and saw Thomas standing in the middle of Route 351, completely still, while those glowing eyes in the forest moved closer, forming a protective circle around him. The next morning, all 6 students woke up with identical marks on their left wrists. Small, circular burns that looked like they'd been made by something touching them with incredible heat. The burns never fully healed, remaining as faint scars for the rest of their lives. None of them ever spoke about what they saw that night, and none of them ever returned to Beaver County. Deputy Sheriff William Grant found Thomas later that night, sitting on the shoulder of the road, waiting for the sunrise. Grant had been called about a disturbance, but arrived too late to catch the perpetrators. "Mr. Mercer," the deputy said, "are you all right? Did those people hurt you?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his scarred face turned toward the deputy, though he couldn't see him. Then he spoke in his raspy, damaged voice. "I'm fine, deputy. The road takes care of those who walk it with respect, and it has other ways of dealing with those who don't." Grant helped Thomas find the broken pieces of his walking stick and drove him home. As they pulled into Thomas's driveway, the deputy couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching them from the trees the entire drive. Over the years, Thomas became a legend, but the stories took on darker tones. There were reports of cars that harassed Thomas experiencing sudden, inexplicable mechanical failures. Brakes would fail, engines would die, tires would burst without explanation. Some vehicles were found abandoned on Route 351, their occupants nowhere to be found, the cars still running with doors wide open. A group of teenagers who threw rocks at Thomas one night crashed their car into a tree just 2 miles down the road. All 3 survived, but they claimed that in the moments before the crash, they saw Thomas standing in the middle of the road ahead of them, even though he'd been a mile behind them just seconds before. A man who deliberately tried to hit Thomas with his truck swerved at the last second, his vehicle plunging into a ravine. When rescuers found him hours later, he was babbling incoherently about the face in the darkness and eyes that see everything. He spent 6 months in a psychiatric hospital. People began to wonder, was Thomas Mercer really just a disfigured man taking walks? Or had that accident on the bridge all those years ago changed him into something else? Something that the darkness recognized and protected. There were also the kindnesses that few people talked about. Sarah Chen, A young woman whose car broke down on Route 351 in 1978 was found by Thomas. Unable to see her distress but hearing her crying beside the road, he sat with her, keeping her company. She later said she felt safer than she ever had, sitting beside that scarred, gentle man in the darkness. And that while they waited, she heard what sounded like footsteps circling them in the trees. But whatever was out there never came close. Mark Rodriguez, a teenager who'd run away from his abusive father, encountered Thomas one night and broke down, telling this faceless stranger all his problems. Thomas listened without judgment, and when Mark was finished, he told him, "Go to the church in town, ask for Father O'Brien, tell him Thomas sent you, he'll help you." Mark did exactly that, and Father O'Brien helped him get placed with foster parents who actually cared for him. These stories spread too, though not as quickly or as dramatically as the scary ones. People began to understand that the Green Man, the Night Walker, the monster of Route 351, he was just Thomas Mercer, a man who'd suffered a terrible accident and was doing his best to live a quiet life. Or was he? Thomas Mercer continued his nighttime walks until June 11th, 1985. He was 76 years old when he died peacefully in his sleep, his scarred hands folded across his chest, a small smile on what remained of his face. The funeral at St. Mary's was packed. Hundreds of people came, some who had known him, some who had only heard the stories, and some who had been among those who tormented him and wanted to ask forgiveness, even if he could no longer hear them. Father O'Brien's eulogy was simple. Thomas Mercer was judged by his appearance his entire life, but God judges us by our hearts, and Thomas's heart was pure. He taught us that true horror isn't in how someone looks, it's in how we treat one another. He taught us that monsters are made, not born. And he taught us that grace can exist in the darkest places. After the funeral, something remarkable happened. People began walking Route 351 at night, retracing Thomas's path. They said they did it to honor his memory, to reclaim those dark roads from fear and transform them into something sacred. But some people swear that on certain nights, particularly humid August nights, when the air is heavy and the darkness is complete, you can still hear the sound of a walking stick striking the pavement along Route 351, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the dark. They say that if you're ever lost or alone on that road, if you're ever in danger or despair, you might see a figure emerge from the shadows, not to frighten you, but to walk beside you, to keep you company in the darkness, to remind you that you're not alone. And they say that those who would do harm on that stretch of road, those who speed recklessly, those who seek to hurt others, those who carry cruelty in their hearts, might see him too. But for them, the experience is very different. For them, Thomas doesn't walk beside them, he walks toward them, and behind him, the darkness follows, patient and hungry and eternal. The thing you should fear most is not the man with the scarred face walking the lonely roads at night. What you should fear is becoming the kind of person who would torment him. Because the road remembers, and the road never forgets. Stay safe, guys.